guys for not leaving.
We were worried everyone might leave.
Here. I know. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. I am Lauren Brickley, Vice President. Lauren Brickley Allen, I might say that. Lauren Brickley, Vice President of Sales with Mobilefuse. We help brands understand consumer mindset across mobile and CTV. And I will let Marci introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. It's good to see some familiar faces in the room. I'm Marci Raible, and I'm at the Campbell Soup Company, and I work on integrated marketing.
Amazing. All right, well, I know we're in the 3 o'clock spot, so everybody probably has a lot going on in their brains. Why don't we start a little easy? How was holiday break? Did you do anything fun?
Holiday break was great. I did not have to suffer the travel dilemma of the U.S. I actually went to Portugal, and thankfully all the planes were on time. Weather not so great, but everything else was good.
Amazing. Yeah. I got my 20-month-old on skis, so that was the highlight of my...
amazing.
Yeah, it was great. All right, anyway, we'll jump into it. So we'd love to hear just a little bit about your past roles before we start talking about Campbell's and how that's really shaped everything that you're doing today at Campbell's.
Sure. So while I work at a CPG company, I'm not a traditional CPG marketer. I started on the agency side and then moved into telecommunications. So I worked in telecommunications, Bell South, AT&T, helped to launch Singular, helped to tear Singular down. And then I joined Bank of America. And after Bank of America, joined the Campbell Soup Company. And so a very different path, but I think has taught me a lot as it relates to, just when it's great when you have first-party data and what you do when you don't have first-party data.
Yeah. And you've been at Campbell's for a while now, right?
Yeah, I've been there for 9 years.
9 years.
Yeah, I sometimes think about it as 9 first years because just the transformation and how we keep driving transformation and really thinking differently about how we go to market is how I like to think about it.
I love that. I've been at Mobilefuse 11 years. Nobody stays anywhere that long. It's great.
Yeah.
So your team handles a lot across so many different disciplines, from integrated experiences across paid and earned media. How are you just making sure that every one of those elements is aligned and informed of each other?
Yeah, I think this is one of the hardest things because everyone's like heads down, moving fast and furiously in their own space. And so during COVID, actually, at the very beginning, what we realized is since we were all remote, we had to start coming together. And we created 2 times a week what we just called stand-up meetings. 30 minutes, it was almost like speed dating. Every team stood up and just talked about what the hot items were on their list. And what it really gave us the opportunity to do was connect dots. And so it wasn't about going deep into conversations there about, how we could do it, but it was more about hearing what was going on and then letting people connect outside the room. And so we've continued those even as we've come back into the office and have actually added a more formal meeting that we call Connect the Dots, where we do go deep on, the connections that happen between.
Yeah, that's amazing. We should do something like that at Mobilefuse. I love that. Really quick meetings. Everybody just stands up. So, Campbell's is a brand that's been around for a long time. There are so many brands in the portfolio. How do you make sure that each brand is staying so agile and really just kind of optimizing whether it's good or bad across each brand?
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that was a benefit of coming from the other industries that I worked in. So when you think about, or when I was in telecommunications, it was about performance marketing, but similar to what the woman said previously, we didn't think about it as, upper and lower funnel. It was really, everything was performance marketing. Is it short-term or long-term gain that you're driving? And so that idea of continuous improvement and that you learn as much from what doesn't work as what does work it has just stayed with me. And I think the other thing that I was taught very early in my career were learning agendas and the power of a learning agenda. One, being really clear on what you're trying to learn from the beginning, because you can test a lot of stuff. And if you don't actually have a plan, it doesn't add up to much. So how do you be really thoughtful about what you're trying to learn and then setting the course and then keep learning from it? So we do a lot of 1.0, 2.0s, or we also jokingly refer to it as iterate to great.
Yeah, that's great. And I guess thinking of, I hate to say this, but the uncertain times that maybe I had, I'm so sick of the word uncertain. I hate to even use that. We overuse that during COVID. But how do you guys plan for that? What are you thinking when you're thinking ahead just in terms of being able to stay agile on that topic of agility?
Yeah. Again, the beauty of coming from the categories that I come from, I joke that I had the Midas touch of joining just when the industries were being completely disrupted. When I was at in Bell South. It was how do you move from local and long distance telephony to broadband and wireless, and sitting in meetings really going, how are we going to make money in this new space? And then when I joined Bank of America 30 days after I got there, Bear Stearns collapsed, and it became, how do you save a brand when you're the poster child for everything wrong with the global economy? And so that living in ambiguity is kind of now in me. And so I think at Campbell's, we have much less of that ambiguity, thankfully. But it is about making sure you have a vision of where you want to go to, but the path to get there doesn't have to be static. And so you start out with a plan, but your plan should change as you learn what things are staying the same, what things are changing, what's working, what's not working. And so that vision can always stay, the same where you're trying to get to, but how you get there should be evolving and getting better.
So then no matter what happens in the economy, you guys are kind of ready to pivot.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is, I had this early in my career where one of my bosses just guided me, don't fall in love with the idea, because when you fall in love with the idea, it becomes really hard to pivot. And so if you're actually really focused on just the performance, and then the ideas get better as you learn more, it becomes a lot easier. And and then you don't worry so much about if the idea worked or didn't work. It's like, what are you driving for the business?
Yeah. And that makes me think about one of the things we chatted about yesterday, just successes and failures that you've had overall. I mean, I think personally, I learn a lot from my failures. Do you have anything to share with everybody in terms of successes that have really kind of shaped what you do moving forward, or any failures that you've really learned a lot?
Yes. When she asked me this, I said, well, I have a lot of failures. The key is failing fast and learning from it. And the one that really sticks out for me, because I actually think you learn more from what doesn't work than what does. When it works, it's great. Like just, put more into it. It's when it doesn't work and you have to really dig deep to understand why it didn't work. Were there assumptions that you made that were incorrect? Did something change? And that understanding is really what gets you further. I gave the example of when I first joined Campbell's, they were launching a new product and they did an integration with Angry Birds. Angry Birds was super hot, super hot game. And so putting the product into the game was just a great way to bring it to market. And I think when you looked at it at the surface, everything lined up really well. But when you saw how it came to life, it was very much, in my opinion, kind of an insert brand here. And it wasn't authentic to the brand. The connectivity wasn't really there. Fast forward 3 to 4 years later, we actually did an integration with a new Angry Birds release that was coming out. And we did it this time with Goldfish and integrated Goldfish fully into the game and built it into the game. It ended up being, one of the most popular power sources for the game. We took what was supposed to be a 3-month program and ended up extending it for almost a year. And when you looked at the end of campaign results, it was one of the top performers of all of the tactics that we had used. And I think that really comes down to a consumer insight and a consumer understanding, cultural truth, and then a brand truth. And it's when you bring those 3 things together that you really find the magic.
Yeah, that's great. You have so many brands across the portfolio, and it seems like in that case, you really kind of personalize that brand to the Angry Birds. It all was a great fit there. Mm-hmm. With so many brands, I don't even know if you are all familiar from Cape Cod, of course, the soups, right? Everybody knows the soups, but Cape Cod potato chips, Late July. There's so many great brands within the portfolio. How are you connecting with the consumer? Is there just a coherent underpinning of your marketing strategy across all brands, or are you kind of just using those activations like you gave the example of specifically to each brand?
Yeah. Probably much to the chagrin of Jen Burns, who's my partner in crime here from Spark. Much to her chagrin, we actually customize all of our approaches brand by brand. I'm not a big fan of cookie cutter, and I think a key is really understanding the business and what's happening with that business, and how can the work that we do, how can marketing communications, marketing activation really help to change the trajectory of the business. And so that customization is key to the success. And I think we do share learnings across, right? Because I don't want every brand to have its own learning path. And it would be death by 1,000 cuts if we did it that way. So we do share learnings across, but it is a custom approach to go to market. And I think that's the magic, because what we have to do for Campbell's, which is really around modernizing this iconic brand, versus what we need to do with a new product coming to market is very different. And so how we think about that needs to be different.
Yeah, I love that. I think personalization is key. That's not what we're talking about today. That could be a whole nother, that could be our next panel, Brand Innovators. But I think that's key just to brand success. I hate if I am seeing the same exact type of ad my husband is seeing. We're different consumers. I like that personalization element. So of course, Campbell's has been around for over 150 years. Great brand awareness. I think probably 80% of people in the room had or made a green bean casserole with a cream of mushroom soup over Thanksgiving, right? I did.
Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully. If you didn't, next year. But so they have, you don't have a brand awareness problem, but I'm sure that you have strong performance goals. So how do you manage that brand awareness and performance together, those goals?
Yeah, and similar to what the woman on the last panel said, thinking about performance and equity as two different things. Left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing is not something that I believe in. I'm totally aligned with her that you actually need to think about the whole funnel and how they work together. I think one of the things from when I was in telecommunications was it was really about how you time them together when you drive more for the business when they're connected and sitting right on top of each other versus when one softens the market for the other. And that one, how do you get to that 1 + 1 = 3 or 1 + 1 = 5, as I like to say? And so we do that same thing at Campbell's, even though I don't have that traditional, performance marketing, short-term, closed loop that I'm driving at Campbell's. We do think of it that way. What am I trying to achieve short-term versus long-term? How do the two fit together? And so how do we break down those silos, which traditionally in a CPG company you have, right? Shopper sits in the sales organization, consumer marketing sits in the marketing organization. And so how do we try to keep breaking down those silos and really build one path? We just did it with consumer journeys. We used to have a consumer journey and a shopper journey. We've broken that down and now have one consumer journey that's inclusive of the shopper journey. And so it's just how do you keep thinking holistically and build it that way? And then what's working, what's not working so that you can shift funds really quickly.
Yeah. And I guess on that note of shifting funds and tracking and performance, you had mentioned that you have a little bit of a different lens on measurement than traditional CPG companies. Do you want to share that?
Sure. And I think it might actually be similar to the Zappos woman as well, which is I don't believe in the silver bullet. And I think a lot of, there's an over-reliance on MMX, which I think MMX plays a very important role and gives some really good information, but it is a single methodology. And so we think of it as a layered approach, and we really think about, the speed at which I can get that information as well. So what can I get real time? And then how do I layer in more learnings as I go? And MMX becomes a piece of the layered equation versus the equation. And that, I think, is the key for us. And what we had to do when we started out is what's the correlation or the causal relationship between those front-end metrics and end-of-campaign metrics. So it's a path that you have to go on, but if you, lay it out, you can get there. And then always thinking short-term, long-term. So we think about the sales performance as well as the brand performance. So we're constantly looking at both.
Yeah, and so from those metrics, you were able to see that video was really a great performer for you all, and Campbell's was one of the first ones to be in the CTV space or to shift spend to the CTV space. Do you want to tell me a little bit about that decision, what informed that, why you guys are there?
Yeah, sure. We tried to start breaking down those traditional kind of way of thinking of like TV, radio, print, and that thinking about it by media type and more thinking about it from a consumer perspective. And so what's the format of choice from consumers, right? And so clearly video, it's America, video is the format of choice. And so when you think about it from video, that's the first thing. Okay, from a video perspective, then it's, okay, what's the delivery mechanisms and what screen are they getting it on? And so when you think about that, when you look at our brands, video might be the first format for many of them, but the prioritization of screens and the delivery mechanism looks very different depending on the brand and the audience that we're going after. And so that's why for us, CTV was already a part of our mix when the pandemic happened and viewership really spiked. So it wasn't a massive shift for us like it was for a lot of other brands. It was more, we were already there. How do we take the learnings that we already have and then just, of course, then balance to based on consumer behavior?
Yeah, and now with the interactive activity of CTV that you can actually, I think consumers are understanding since the Super Bowl last year that if there's a QR code there, you can scan it and maybe add that soup to your cart, add those chips to your cart and make it so easy. I think that's just going to take off even more and more this year?
Yeah, shoppability definitely is becoming more and more a part of our conversation and how we think about it. Clearly, retail media networks are a big part of the equation and conversation as well. So how do we think about the retail media networks, but how do we really think about shoppability across the whole journey? And that's why that holistic consumer journey became so important, because how the journey looks for beverage is very different than how it looks for a simple meal.
Yeah. So thinking of seasonality, because again, I hate to say it, but sometimes when I think of Campbell's, I think of soup in the winter. How do you deal with that? Are you pushing snacks more in the off season? You tell me what you're doing to kind of get people out of that way of thinking.
When we talked about this earlier, I joked that our finance guy probably thinks about how the brands balance across the year. We actually think about individual brands and what are we doing with them. So when we think about soup, there is a clear seasonality, right? Cold weather, you think soup. But for us, it is also about how do we win holiday? So how do our brands actually come more into that cooking experience that happens over the holidays? How is it more than just green bean casserole? And then we also think about how do we actually change the behavior outside of the traditional soup season. A recipe strategy is a big part of that equation, and then rethinking the recipe strategy that we go to market with, right? Clearly, cream of chicken and cream of mushroom are the traditional cooking soups, but during COVID, it became this unlock as people got more confident in the kitchen. And we were working with one of our media partners and one of their chefs who had a recipe for tomato risotto and used tomato soup for tomato risotto. And Unscripted said that it was actually better than using fresh tomatoes or canned tomatoes because it had more flavor. And so that just started to unlock a totally different way to think about, what would traditionally be thought of as an eating soup as more of a cooking. And so how do we use that cooking behavior, which is year round, to really drive performance?
Yeah, and I think that's a great example of how Campbell's was really there for consumers during the pandemic. I went from eating out 3 to 5 nights a week to like downtown Chicago to living with my parents in the suburbs of Boston with my husband. And like we were trying to figure out how to cook every night. And Campbell's was definitely one of those brands that helped us just make it easy. You didn't have to think about dinner. So I'm sure you gained so many new customers during the pandemic, but now people are kind of back. I mean, look at all of us. We're all back. People are out at restaurants. How are you maintaining that momentum and those customers back to somewhat reality? Is it ever reality again? I don't know.
A couple things. I think one of the things that was great about the pandemic was it was a lot of younger audiences coming into the portfolio, which was great to, kind of reintroduce or introduce Campbell's to them in perhaps a broader way than they thought of us, not just from a nostalgia perspective, but also from a relevant for me today. And I think one of the things that we really saw during the pandemic was the confidence in the kitchen. So people started, cooking, and then the confidence expanded. And so as we thought about that, it was really a rethinking of our strategy, and particularly our recipe strategy, that we've carried forward. And so we just continue to evolve that recipe strategy and really use that as a way to stay relevant with younger and more diverse households. And I think that's been part of the fun in doing it, that it keeps it really fresh and exciting, and finding new ways and new uses for our brands.
Yeah, that's great. I always need some new ways and new uses for things in the kitchen. When dinner time comes, I'm like, oh man. So anything that makes it easy.
I think one of the other things from the pandemic, and I don't know if everybody else experienced this, but because we were all working separately, remotely, there was the connection across all of us, but there was also just, it was like time was slow and fast at the same time. And so how we had to keep a pulse on what was happening with the consumer, and, just looking at things looking at that data constantly, and that confidence in the kitchen. And that is one thing that we have continued doing. We have a group that we call Culture Vultures. There's a part of it at the agency and a part on our team to keep that pulse on culture and really moving at the speed of culture. And I think we built that we built that skill and the muscle behind it during the pandemic when we were really forced to.
Culture vultures. I love that. I need that in my life. I'm like, I can't keep up with anybody now with these kids.
It takes a village.
Yeah, it really does. That's great. Well, I know that you have brought to life some great partnerships while you've been at Campbell's, and we have one here we want to show today, and I want to make sure that we have time to show it. So do we want to talk about this a little bit before we kind of get to the end and make sure we leave time for questions? Because This is fun.
For us, when we thought about modernizing Campbell's and how do we really go about it, we started thinking about what can come from our voices versus what do we need from the voice of others. And when we're thinking about the voice of others, when is that an individual, an influencer, which could be a credentialized influencer like a nutritionist or a lifestyle influencer? And when does it also help to use the voice of a media partner or another brand? And so when we think about our equation to go to market, it really is thinking first and foremost about that, and how do we use the combination of voices to really get the full story told. I will say I was fortunate enough to have learned this going through the financial crisis and being at Bank of America and how we thought about that, but we really have put it to use here at Campbell's too. This is a video of what we did for the holidays, which is very different than we have gone after the holidays before. I think everybody knows green bean casserole, and so that's always been a part of our equation. But this is a little bit about how Campbell showed up this holiday season. Hopefully some of you saw it.
And then you just simply go all the way around.
Main dishes are cute, but it's all about the size.
Amazing. It's always about the sides.
Always about the sides.
I really am not a turkey lover. It's just the sides for me. That's great. You guys are spot on with that. Amazing. How are we doing for time? We have a couple more? Okay. All right. Yeah, great. Okay. So I think the one thing that, I'm always curious about from your standpoint is there's so much going on with digital transformation, emerging technologies, NFTs, metaverse, all these things. How do you stay on top of that?
Well, the good thing is I have a team, so that's always good. Yeah. And I do think we challenge each other to, bring it to the forefront and have conversations about it. But we also have a learning agenda, and we work really closely with our partners at Spark and across our agency teams to really think about what's happening in the marketplace and what do we know and what do we need to learn. And if we need to learn, which is the first brand that we should take into that space. And so when we did NFT, which we actually did a little over 2 years ago, I think, it had been tried with one of our brands first, but kind of done very quietly. And we were getting ready to bring to market a new design for our condensed soup, which is our red and white label. And that's always, a little challenging when you're touching an iconic label. And so when we thought about how to make it relevant to consumers, though, the first thing we thought of was our connection to art. And okay, what is the modern twist on art in today's world, which was the NFT. And so it became a really natural space for us to play and test out. It isn't something that we've continued, but we tested it out. We think that it worked really well because it was authentic to Campbell's, and it was also something that was happening in culture. Yeah. Fast forward to Metaverse, where we're actually getting ready to do a test with Chunky because of Chunky's success in the gaming space. And so it's just a much more natural place to test. So I think for us, it's always about what's that learning agenda. You don't need to try everything. So it's being really clear about what you do need to try. I've been there when it's like, just test everything. And then you step back and you go, okay, what did we learn and what can we do with any of this? So we're really thoughtful and focused on what we're testing and where we're testing, and then what's the best brand to do it with.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm sure the measurability of it all is important, right? So
Figuring out, and being really clear about what you're trying to learn from it. I think that is key also, because sometimes it is just about, can your brand be accepted in that space? And so I think being really clear about what you're trying to learn.
Yeah, that's great. All right, well, I want to make sure I leave time for questions. So my last question for you, what are you most excited about for 2023?
Most excited about, I'm excited for what our brands are bringing forward. So I think that's a really fun part of what we do. We challenge ourselves. We have a whole focus on marketing innovation and how do we really bring that to life across our brands. But I think in the industry, what I'm most excited about is just the creativity that I think we keep pushing. I think everybody is talking about streaming and, the consumer moving there, which clearly starts to unlock changes in behavior. But I think Netflix and Disney Plus entering into the streaming game also, I think, will bring really interesting things to the forefront, and I think really pushing our creativity. And I think we need to do that as well, and really do it across the board. So just that opportunity to be more creative and bring new ideas into the space.
I love that. That's great. Well, hopefully we have a wonderful 2023 and there's no uncertain words anywhere.
Exactly.
Great. All right. Well, I will open it up to questions now if we have a few more minutes.
Thank you. This is awesome. I appreciate the time, everything. John from 1440. When you think about retail media, what are the KPIs that you're thinking about? Like, are you looking at LTV, incrementality, like new to brand, new to engage? Like, what are the things that you and your team are looking at? I would assume like Walmart, Target, Amazon are the key ones. Is that right?
Yeah, well, actually, all of the retailers offer them now. So I think that's one thing. And the other thing I think that's really interesting, there are the retailers that we work with directly who are offering them, but you also have other retailers offering them, right? Gap, et cetera, Marriott, who are doing it. And so I think the key thing for us is there isn't just a one, I'm always looking for this one KPI. So it really depends on the intent that we're going in to the conversation with. And I think there's also, is it something that's happening on their platform, or is it a place where I'm using their data off platform? And those definitely are going to have very different KPIs. I think the key thing though is when you show up as a media company, you have to be a media company. And so being able to have those media conversations, I think, is critically important. And being able to talk about being clear on what that KPI is a key part of the conversation.
We have one over here.
When you, Michael Teicher with Scripps Networks, when you do tests, whether it's in the metaverse or NFTs, are you tapping into existing media budgets or R&D?
Oh, that's a great question. We actually tap into existing media budgets. And so we're thinking about it from that perspective, but it is within your mix. How do you make sure that you're testing new things? I think the other thing is a lot of times they might cross over media budgets as well as production budgets, right? If you're creating something in the space. So I think also thinking about, it doesn't always just have to be the working media budget that gets utilized, but how are you bringing it to life?
All right, this is the final question for this session.
Thank you. I was curious, as a CPG company, I'm Jennifer Churchill, how are you guys thinking about the economy heading into this year, actually? Because I've heard a lot of, like, from the brands that I work, like, sort of stops, but then starts again. And I've heard, well, the finance team is really nervous, so they're putting pressure on the marketing teams. Like, how is that being addressed at a company like Campbell's?
Thank you. That's Jennifer Churchill at Cargill. Yeah, I mean, I think for us, we have we have a really good relationship with our finance team, so staying really, really close to that. But I think it always is about prioritization, and that's for us at any time of, what's happening in the marketplace, in today's world or how it was 3 years ago. It really is about the prioritization of our brands. So what's the objective that we're trying to get to? And then the prioritization. I think we talked a lot about the agility. We're always thinking about that agility, what's working, what's not working. If it's not working, then you have to shift it to what is working. And that could be within a brand, or that could be across brands. And I think we are just applying those same principles as we go into the marketplace in this year. I do think from a consumer perspective, what we're being really focused on is what's the value proposition that we actually bring to the market, and making sure that we're very clear in the value that each of our brands brings, and that is not the same for all of them. And so making sure that we have that understanding of where our brand fits into our consumer's life, I think that's the starting point for everything.
Well, thank you so much. Great.
Thank you.